Good evening. Thank you for coming out here tonight. I'm Nancy Bass-Wyden. I'm the owner of the Strand bookstore. For a little bit of history, the store was founded by my grandfather, Benjamin Bass, in 1927 in an area that was called Book Row. It was located on 4th Avenue, and it ran from Astor Place to Union Square. And at its height, there were 48 bookstores. And right now, Strand's the only survivor from that time, thanks to voracious readers like you. And tonight is a special treat for our store. That's because we are fans of 100% of Oregon's United States senators. So one of them is my husband, Ron Wyden. The other is our guest tonight, Jeff Merkley. Jeff is born and bred Oregonian. After graduating from Stanford University, he earned a Master's of Public Affairs from Princeton University. He was the executive director of Portland's Habitat for Humanity until 1994, and then elected to Oregon's House of Representatives. As Speaker of the Oregon House, he led the fight for economic justice, such as landmark policies to stop payday lending ripoffs. He was elected to the Senate in 2009 after a tough race against incumbent Senator Gordon Smith. Jeff couldn't. Since then, he's been the leading progressive voice in the Senate. Jeff could not have picked a more important and timely topic for tonight. When you think things will improve, Trump's policies make them worse. Today's headlines are unbelievable. Trump administration officials moved to hold immigrant children and parents longer. Senator Merkley is uniquely qualified to talk about immigrants. He prickled the conscience of the nation when he was the first senator to go to the border and expose the inhumane conditions facing children and families there. Here at the Strand, we agree that with Jeff that America is better than this. Welcome, Senator Merkley.
Well, greetings, everyone, and thank you so much for coming. I've never done anything like this. And we are so privileged today to have a co-host who is an extraordinary advocate on immigration issues. So please join me in welcoming Becca Heller. She is the head of a group that she founded called IRAP, International Refugee Assistance Project. And before we actually dive into the story of the book or the story of the border, I'd like to ask her to share a little bit about her organization, which I know could use all of your help.
Sure. So IRAP stands for the International Refugee Assistance Project. We provide legal assistance to refugees and displaced people, especially unaccompanied kids all over the world, including at the southern border and kids in Central America who want to reunite with their parents. We became somewhat infamous about 7 days after President Trump was sworn into office when he issued the Muslim ban, and we organized thousands of lawyers all over the country to go to airports to try to represent people who were being held there. And we were also able to win an injunction against the Muslim ban within about 28 hours of its signing. And we've tried to sort of keep up that pace ever since. So it's an honor to be here today and to be fighting alongside people like Senator Merkley to try to mitigate the damage that's being done against immigrants in our country as much as possible.
We thought it would be more interesting to have this be as a dialogue, and so we're going to talk back and forth, and Becca's going to ask some challenging questions or maybe throw in some substantial comments. And then we're going to turn to all of you for your thoughts and questions. So maybe we'll go for 20, 25 minutes or until we feel like it's time to pivot, and we'll turn to all of you.
No one told me that I could wear jeans.
Oh, wow, you know what? Welcome to Oregon.
You're not in Oregon. So you've clearly always had a passion for social justice. I mean, we heard that in hearing about your biography and in the book, and I don't want to spoil it for anybody. But you spent time in the 1980s in Ghana and then in Central America. But for the first 8 or 9 years of your Senate career, immigration wasn't really one of your issues. Can you talk about what changed that?
You're absolutely right. Growing up, I was a blue-collar kid from a small mill town, and then I heard about the possibility of being an exchange student in West Africa, in Ghana. So in high school, age 16, I was so lucky to be able to go and to live among people who were earning $1 a day, living a very, very different life from America. And then I had the chance to work in villages in Mexico, to travel through Central America, to spend time in India, so I feel a connection to parts of the world where people are very much struggling. But I'll tell you, I feel a really powerful connection to the vision of the Statue of Liberty, which is so not very far away from here. And she's holding a torch to the world with those powerful words, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses, yearning to breathe free." The idea that America would help people in trouble, refugees fleeing religious persecution, fleeing civil war, fleeing famine, and give them a chance to get their feet on the ground and contribute to this world in their lifetime. That's a powerful vision. And the thing that really made me pivot with full attention to immigration was when I read Jeff Sessions' speech. His speech he was given in California, zero tolerance speech, and he basically said, we're going to extinguish Lady Liberty's torch. Now, that's not the words he used, but when he said, we are going to deliberately harm children to deter refugees from wanting to come to America, my jaw dropped. And it was that following Sunday that I flew down to see if this was really happening, because I really didn't believe it was. I really thought this was campaign talk in preparation for 2018.
Thought it was rhetoric.
I thought it was rhetoric, that no American leader would deliberately plan on traumatizing children. And so it was that Sunday I went down, I got into the Customs and Border Protection, CBP facility, and in that facility, I saw the children being sorted into cages, these 30 by 30 foot chain link cages in a warehouse, who had been separated from their parents. And I couldn't believe it was happening. Basically, no member of Congress had seen that. And I was so stunned by it. I went outside and the press were saying, what is going on in there? And I tried to describe it to them. And I thought, is this really the case? But one of these, as they toured me around the warehouse, there was one particular cage that the boys were lining up by height to get a meal. And the shortest was just knee-high to a grasshopper, maybe 4 years old. And then a little bit older, a little bit older, a little bit taller. And I said, did you take these children away from their parents? And the CBP leader said, well, not all of them. And I said, by that you mean some were unaccompanied older children? He said, yes. But the rest you separated? Yes, we did. And there were girls in another cage, and fathers and mothers. And if those little boys in that cage I was at looked hard, they might get a glimpse of a parent or a sister in another cage and not know if they'll ever see them again. And then just hours later, I went up the road to Brownsville. I had been told by immigration advocates that there were hundreds of boys being stuffed into a former Walmart in Brownsville. So I went to check it out. My team had asked for permission for me to get in, had been turned down. We asked for a waiver, it was turned down. Decided to go anyway. I'm like, if it's a big facility and they got hundreds of people, they've got somebody who can at least come outside and talk to me. They wouldn't come outside and talk to me. And in fact, they called the police. So
They called the police on you.
they called the police on me,
And what were you doing that was illegal?
and what I was doing was standing at the front door of the Walmart, waiting for the supervisor to come out and talk to me. And at that moment, I thought, wow, this could get very interesting. I have never been handcuffed and thrown to the ground, and I thought, but my time may have come.
Do you have a good lawyer?
Well, I do not, but I know who to come to.
I was going to say.
Yeah, I know where the resources. So I just felt like we have to fight for the vision of America that is being destroyed by this administration. That is what has put me on this path for this last 14 months.
And I think a lot of Americans had a similar experience. I mean, I've been doing immigration advocacy for about 9 years, which maybe seems long, but is my entire career, such as it is. And you look at polling, and I think most people don't really feel one way or the other about it, is what you find. Like, people just don't think that it's their issue. But then I think when these images of children in cages started coming up, it really mobilized so many Americans who I think had a similar experience to you, to say, like, how could this be happening here? Aren't we better than this?
No, it touched a lot of people's hearts. I've been involved in a lot of battles on a lot of issues, things like stopping predatory mortgages, which destroy the finances of millions of families and turn home ownership into a nightmare, like stopping payday lenders who charge 500% interest rates, taking on different environmental battles. But never has there been an issue where people came up to me across the country and start crying. And on this has happened time and time again, with people coming up and saying, I can't believe what America is doing, what Trump is doing. And I think there's just images burned into our minds. The kids in cages images are burned into our minds. The little girl being torn away from her mother at the borders burned into our minds. The father and daughter, Oscar and Valeria, dying swimming across the river a few weeks ago, is burned into our mind. And there's so much, the administration just will not level with the American people. They will tell you, we can instantly connect a parent with a child after we've separated them, and it's absolutely not true, and so on and so forth, through a whole set of immigration issues. They have no hesitancy about misleading, and that's, I guess, the politest way I can put it, the American public about what they're doing.
So I want to ask sort of two separate questions about dehumanization, because that's a theme that comes up in your book. And the first one is an abstract question, and the second one is a specific question. So, abstractly, you talk about how the family separation policy, or the child separation policy, has a lot in common with things like the Muslim ban, the rescission of the dreamer status for kids who came here undocumented but made it through school, that it's all sort of this larger effort to dehumanize certain parts of the population. Can you talk about how you see those things fitting together?
Yes. And this is not just a piece of America now. This is a part of history across the planet, that petty dictators will use the tribal instincts of individuals to pitch one group against another, and to particularly set the stage for brutal treatment of that group. They engage in dehumanization. It's when Trump talks about hordes of rapists and murderers crossing the border, that's what he's doing. When he talks about infestations, that's what he's doing. When he talks about their animals, that's what he's doing. When he says they're all gang members, that's what he's doing. The truth is that immigrants commit crimes at a lower rate than native-born Americans. That's the truth. But you would never know that from this administration. And so I think about how we've seen this in our history. We've seen it with the dehumanization of slaves, with Chinese immigrant workers. We've seen it as the ways we describe the Germans in World War II, or the Vietnamese or Japanese also in World War II. It's, the Vietnamese in the Vietnam War. And so that's what he's engaged in, and doing so then means can manifest itself in many ways, as you've been describing. The Muslim ban, creating religious divisions, the comments that he's made about African Americans and Haitian Americans and women Americans and Americans with disabilities, the whole list. But there are more pieces of this puzzle directed towards immigrants than any other group. We have to recognize this strategy. We've seen it in world history. We've seen it in our prior history. We have to rebel against it.
So that brings me to my second question, which is more specific, which is let's try to rehumanize the story a little bit. I think that we talk about these things in the abstract, and we allow the narrative to be dominated by these abstract concepts of like, oh, the migrant caravans have been infiltrated by terrorists, or oh, everyone's a criminal. You have a lot of really touching moments in the book where you talk about specific families that you really connected with. Can you give us just a specific story of where rehumanize this for us, right? Put a human face on this for us.
So I want to share a story with you about a mother and daughter that I met on my second trip to the border. It was 2 weeks after my first trip. I had gone back. I took a congressional delegation. Amazing, when you have reinforcements, you get into all the facilities. And we got the press into the facilities, which was powerful. But we also went out onto the bridge between Reynosa and Hidalgo near McAllen on the border. And on my previous trip, I had been told by an ACLU volunteer advocate, Jennifer Harbury, that there were 50 people on the bridge in this 100-degree plus heat, high humidity, and they'd been there for 7 to 10 days, being blocked from coming through the doors of the port facility. So I wanted to go out, take the congressional delegation out there to see it. And they said, well, there's nobody on the bridge. There's nothing to see. I said, well, we'll go out and see for ourselves. We go out on the bridge, and nobody's camped out on the bridge anymore. Instead, there's Customs and Border Protection officers at the dividing line of the bridge, the painted line on the bridge, blocking any refugees from stepping over that line. This, to me, is a complete violation of the Refugee Convention. They were being pushed back into Mexico without friends or funds or family, incredibly dangerous for them. And so we did see something on the bridge. We saw something that had not been seen previously, as far as I know, in our history. It reminds me of the St. Louis, when we turned away a ship from Germany with German refugees in the prelude to World War II, and the ship was sent back eventually to Germany, and a quarter of the people on that ship died in the Holocaust.
And the 75th anniversary of that was just about a month ago.
Yeah. So here we are, rejecting people again. So we came off the bridge, and I said, why are you blocking refugees from asserting their rights under our law and under the Refugee Convention to be able to step in? And they said, oh, we're too busy. And I said, well, all your interview rooms are empty. And we saw on this second trip pretty empty facilities at CBP facility. And they said, oh, well, it's a pipeline and it's really crowded somewhere, so we're not letting people across. They did have one room with about 10 to 12 people in it. And I said, is there anyone in there who didn't have a passport and came across as a refugee? They said, yes, there's a mother and a child.
Why did you ask that question? Because
I didn't know why those 10 to 12 people were there. But I thought maybe they had let one or two people across. In fact, they had said, I think, they had let a couple people across. So I wanted to find out if there was anyone in that room that fit that and I could speak to them. And so they brought out a mother. Her name was Gabriella. She had a 56-day-old child in her arms, which she repeated several times, 56 days old. And we asked her story through a translator. And she said, look, here's the story. We took out a loan from a private bank. My family did. And by private bank, it was probably a cartel or a gang or something of that nature. She said the enforcers have come to our house, and they said, I'm the one to die if we can't repay it. And I was pregnant, and I didn't think they'd kill me while I was pregnant, so I kept hoping we'd repay it until before I was ready to give birth. 8 months pregnant, loans not repaid. I'm going to die. My child's going to die. I fled. And she delivered on the way. I would love to have gotten more of that story, but she delivered somewhere along the way. It took her 3 months to get from her village in Guatemala to that moment, June 17th, 2018, on the border. And so I said to her, we saw the Border Patrol blocking everyone on the bridge, so they let you through because you have baby Andrea in your arms. And she said, oh no, I was rejected and sent back to Mexico 3 times. I said, well, how did you get here? And for just a moment, her face lit up because she had beaten the blockade. And she said, I saw that there was a pedestrian bridge and a car bridge. And on the car bridge were Mexicans who were washing windows for tips. So I went, they had an extra squeegee, I asked to borrow it. I started washing windows, and I washed windows into the United States of America. That's how she got in. That's what it took to get past the blockade. And that little girl in her arms, I can't forget her, Andrea.
That seems like exactly the type of entrepreneurship that we claim to want to bolster this economy.
Yes, exactly.
So you talked a little bit about, in the context of dehumanization, kind of making this a political issue. Do you think, this happened in May and June of 2018, and you talk in the book about how it had been happening sort of quietly before then, but then suddenly they decided to make it public. Do you think that was related to the congressional elections? How is this a political issue?
Absolutely. It was just 13 days after Trump came into office that one of his new officers talked about child separation, but it wasn't really noticed. And then John Kelly talked about it a month later, the new head of the Department of Homeland Security, who then became the chief of staff to Trump. And then
weirdly, whose former job was to keep Central America safe.
And who previously to the administration was on the board of the organization that runs Homestead in Florida.
And has since rejoined, right?
And since rejoined and paid a huge salary for serving on this board.
What is Homestead?
Homestead is the for-profit child prison that got a non-compete contract on the air base at Homestead to imprison migrant children. It's been expanded to hold 3,200 children. At this very moment, it is empty. It's hurricane season. They've moved children out, but they're keeping it operating to move children back in at some point. One of the key rally point that I'm emphasizing is we have to shut this thing down. The contract expires in November, and it's something that we can fight for through our members of Congress. Do not allow this contract to be renewed by the administration. So that's Homestead.
But
What happened to those children, by the way? They were moved like in the middle of the night, right?
Yes, there's been a big drop off in arrivals, the heat of summer, and also there's sometimes some oscillation in the numbers arriving, and so there are lots of vacancies in small facilities across the country, and the children have been moved, and I think to every single one wherever they've been moved are probably much better than Homestead. Homestead has a corrupt incentive to keep those children locked up so they can make more money. There should be no for-profit prison, and there should be no massive prisons. Holding children in small groups so they get attention they need is the right way to approach it, not mega prisons.
what else has, this is a pretty quickly moving situation. What else has changed since the book came out? Or since the copy went to bed?
So shortly before it went, Tornillo was shut down in the desert. So that was a victory.
What's Tornillo?
So Tornillo was run by a nonprofit, BCFS, in Texas. It was the refugee-style camp that held, when I visited it in December of last year, 2,800 kids. But outside pressure, we held a rally outside of it just before Christmas, called for it to be shut down, called for the 1,300 children there who already had sponsors, but the administration was keeping them from going to their homes where they had sponsors, called for those kids to be released. And this is one case that the attention mattered. Plus, the head of BCFS, Kevin Dinnan, he is the one person who's been completely honest about the immigration system and its faults. He lobbied from the inside to shut down Tornillo. He refused to extend the contract. No other contractor would pick it up. We lobbied from the outside, and it shut down. But it was just weeks after that, the administration said, well, we're going to increase the size of Homestead. So it was a bit of a victory, but short-lived. So that's one factor. Then we have just every week something's going on. The administration has proceeded to say, you know what? Doesn't matter that 3 refugee children have died of the flu. We're not going to give flu vaccines at these centers where often they're extraordinarily crowded and flu would move very quickly. The administration has proceeded to appeal a district court decision to the circuit court, and the circuit court just gave an opinion down in which they said, the administration, I mean, this is unbelievable, and I'm saying this, the administration appealed whether they had to provide soap and mattresses for children. Like, they did not want to be compelled to do the very basics of hygiene, nutrition, and a mattress. They wanted kids to have to be sleeping on cold concrete floors. You may have heard of the hieleras, the ice boxes. These are the holding cells deliberately kept cold. They often are concrete. The refugees may be given a Mylar blanket, and you will see these pictures of people just huddled, trying to keep warm, and it's really a form of torture. Plus, the lights are left on all night. I mean, anyway, these are... Is this really happening in America? The deliberate infliction at point after point after point. One thing that has changed is the fingerprints. The administration had attempted to essentially make it extremely hard to get sponsors by saying all of your fingerprints will be taken in the household and all of your information will be turned over to ICE. So it meant families were not coming forward to be sponsors, and the administration would not allow non-family members to be sponsors. People have come up to me all over the country and said, I'd be glad to sponsor one of these children. But they haven't been able to do so because the administration will not let them. So they did back off on this full fingerprinting operation, and they now still are sharing information with ICE, but we got past a provision in Congress that says that the information could not be used to deport people. It could not be used by ICE in that fashion. It's not that comforting because they're still sharing the information, but it is a small change.
Is this still the policy? I mean, it was defeated in a lawsuit. They settled a lawsuit with the ACLU, which said they can no longer separate kids from their families. And yet, in the past couple weeks especially, we keep seeing these articles that secretly they've continued separating children. What is the status of the policy?
Think about the Oval Office.
No.
Okay, don't think about the Oval Office. Do not picture it. But I'll paint a picture for you anyway. President Trump, end of June of last year, he held a press conference and he said, you know, my wife has talked to me, my daughter has talked to me. I really, feel badly about the treatment of children. I'm going to end child separation. That was a complete lie. The court had already told him he had to end child separation. What he had on his desk in front of him was an executive order that had nothing to do with child separation. What it had to do was finding a way to wipe out the Flores settlement agreement and be able to lock up children indefinitely. Internment camps for families, indefinite imprisonment for children. He had in that executive order 3 ideas for how to do this. One was to go to the court and ask them to overturn Flores, which Judge Gee was not going to do.
And just Flores was a court settlement reached in 1997 that set parameters on how long you can keep children in detention and under which conditions.
Yes, basically you have to treat children in a humanitarian way for hygiene and food and water.
It was very wacko leftist.
Yeah, how absurd that you should have to provide water and
To
food.
feed children.
And so here's the administration saying, we want to strike Flores down. And so one was to overturn it in the court. That wasn't going to happen. The second was legislation. In fact, at the press conference, the president says, and I know there'll be legislation. Well, there was. In the House, twice, a bill was put up under the Republican House. It was defeated twice. The Senate then got engaged. Senator Tillis, North Carolina, and Senator Cruz had bills on this. One of them had 40 sponsors. 40 senators signed onto a bill to allow internment camps in the United States of America, the indefinite imprisonment of children. I went to the floor. I gave a speech about the history of internment camps and said, if these bills come to the floor, it will be the biggest battle you've ever seen. We're not going to let this happen in the United States of America. Mitch McConnell did not move those bills to the floor. So the legislative strategy ended there, and then the Democrats took the House, so that put the absolute end to that. So the president then has the third strategy in that executive order, which was to write a regulation to replace the agreement, the Flores settlement agreement. Now, Flores said that if the agreement is put into a regulation or into a law, then Flores goes away after 45 days. But and that's what the president's doing today, right? He's putting out this regulation, but it does not implement Flores. It destroys Flores. It says, oh, we don't need state license, we'll just license ourselves. We don't need state oversight, we will just oversee ourselves. And by the way, that restriction on how long we can lock up children, that's gone. So the president's team said, even as they put this out, we said, we kind of expect the courts to overturn it. Well, yes, they do, because it's completely not in concert with the Flores settlement agreement. But here it is. They're pushing it forward, trying to find a way, any path they can, maybe some unexpected crack in the system to imprison children.
So if they know they're going to lose, why do it?
So let's go back to the question you asked in that regard of June of last year. When Sessions came out with zero tolerance speech, I heard that name and I thought, oh, tough on crime, that sounds like something a Republican administration would do 6 months out from an election. And then I read the details and said, wow, they can't really be doing this like we said. But why then? Why after a year was it basically underground, a pilot project in San Diego sector? Why did they suddenly put it above ground? And my theory of the world is that Republicans run for office on fear. Democrats run on hope. The reason Republicans run on fear is the public generally trusts them more on national security, so fear tends to work for them. The Americans tend to trust Democrats more on the fundamentals for families like health care and housing and education and living wage jobs, so we run on hope. And maybe that's just in the character of more who we are and who they are. But if you're going to run on fear, you have to have something that's fearful, that's scary. And so my belief is the Republican team looked around the world last June and said, you know what, Ebola is no longer scary enough.
Children? They picked children?
So they picked...
Sorry, I didn't mean to jump your punchline. I couldn't believe it.
Yeah, no, Ebola wasn't going to work. Little outbreak in DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo, far away, not going to make the difference. ISIS, didn't hold much territory anymore. Nobody was worried about them coming across
that's
ships.
changing too.
That is
That's
changing.
changed since their book came out.
We may well see that in the next campaign next year, really, and emphasize. So what do they turn to? Immigration. He doubled down on trying to cultivate the fear of immigrants. So that was the political angle to it. And if he wanted to actually solve immigration, we'd go back to the 2013 Senate bill, which had Democrats and Republicans on board, supermajority. It addressed security in many ways at the border or overstaying visas, point of employment, but it also provided flexible visas for addressing the issues of agricultural labor or high-tech labor. It had a pathway to citizenship for folks who had come into the country before that bill was written, so instant legal status and a path to citizenship. That was the grand deal to fix our immigration system. It's the Republicans in the House the Republican-controlled House that said, no, doesn't matter, you have this bipartisan bill that would pass the House, we're not taking it up, and there we are.
So the last question I'll ask, and then we'll turn it over to the audience, is I think the obvious one, which is, I'll divide it into two parts. Part one is, what can we do? And part two is, what can you do?
Was that part one or part two? What can
You can
we
take
do?
them in either
Okay.
order.
So what I'm going to do is keep shining the brightest light I can, and writing a book is part of this. We are all now aware of the horror of the treatment of children and refugee families. But it isn't just how these rules affect them, it affects us. This is the soul of America. Who are we going to be as a country? Are we going to be a country that recognizes people fleeing affliction, that we should assist them just as many of us have ancestors who were assisted as immigrants coming to this country? Are we going to recognize the talents that refugees and immigrants bring that have been so powerful in building this country in every division, from business to the arts? Are we going to go forward with the vision of a united country? We talk about this in our Pledge of Allegiance, one nation under God, indivisible. Why do we say that? Indivisible. We recognize that we are aiming for a vision of working together with all our diverse backgrounds and our diverse religions, our diverse cultures, bringing it together to make America stronger and more successful. Are we going to seize that vision or allow the Trump determination to divide, to deepen racial divides and religious divides, to fracture us as a country, to abandon human rights in the world rather than leading the fight for human rights? So we all have so much at stake here. So I'm going to keep raising this and amplifying it in every way I can. You want to capture the division in the Senate that has been fostered by President Trump. You have 40 Republicans who sponsored that bill to lock up children indefinitely, internment camps and long-term prison for unaccompanied minors. You have not a single Democrat has sponsored it. You have 40 Democrats who have sponsored my bill to stop the cruel treatment of migrant children, and not a single Republican. So we are divided. We are hanging in the balance. So I'm going to keep fighting to tip the balance with the help of people all across America in favor of the vision and relight Lady Liberty's torch. That's what I'm going to do. And I'm going to ask all of you to help in every way you can. Have your book club get together, and if not my book, read some other book on the refugee crisis and hold a discussion about it. What I've tried to do in the book is lay out the many pieces of the puzzle in a very comprehensible way and throw in stories about refugees, so it's not a dry policy tome.
Depends how you feel about policy.
And I've laid
Is
out
policy death?
And I've laid out many things that we could do legislatively, but we can't do those while Mitch McConnell's in charge of the Senate, which means the campaigns of next year really matter. So what you can do, cultivate a conversation, use your social media, use your Facebook, donate to groups like IRAP that are fighting the fight for refugees, Al Otro Lado, which is escorting children across the border who would otherwise be turned back, ACLU down there, people like Jennifer Harbury working on the border to identify the issues and fight for them, in Refugees International, which is lobbying in Washington, D.C. So feel free to support those groups, and if you have time and can go down to the border and volunteer at the homes, I'm calling them homes, that's not the right word, respite centers. Respite centers in El Paso, Annunciation House, or a respite center with the sisters, the Sacred Heart Sisters in McAllen, and or the shelters across the border in Tijuana, where they have 30-some shelters. I visited 7 of them. that is another way to be involved. So your time, your money, your networks, use it all. Thank you. So we have an extra microphone. Oh, Nancy, yes.
Yeah, I just want to take questions.
So thank you very, very much for coming down to New York. Up to New York? Thank you. One direction. So I think your position on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee adds a really interesting vantage point, a view of this issue particularly. I'm wondering if you can shed a little bit of light on how the international community views this issue and in the United States.
Well, I can tell you that it's part of a host of policies that has many of our traditional allies just absolutely confounded. The fact that our president of the United States is basically attacking our allies and cozying up to dictators. That the president of the United States is finding various ways to try to promote Russia rather than defending the United States from Russian election interference. And when it comes to human rights, it spans so many issues. So I went to, if we turn the clock back to 2017, in August of 2017, there was a horrendous genocide in Burma where the Buddhist military had for decades, since 1962, dehumanized a Muslim minority called the Rohingya. And then with Facebook came into effect, they put into a campaign of oppression against the Rohingya. It included burning down their villages, some 300 villages, shooting them from helicopters, mass rape. But the citizens were fed stories over Facebook of terrible things the Rohingya had done against the Buddhists to help fuel this. And so that's a new piece of the challenge. So 700,000 people fled across the river to Bangladesh. So Aung San Suu Kyi, a current Nobel Prize winner, standing up for democratic principles, being under house arrest for decades. But she, as essentially the leader, head of state for Burma, endorsed what happened, which means she's really completely fallen off her pedestal. The United States president, in the face of one of the worst genocides on the planet, has not said one public word. We have abandoned our leadership on human rights. And so throw that in with the rest. And it's not a pretty picture. Our influence in the world, our soft power that comes from the respect of the United States has plummeted through the floor.
Hi, thank you for talking to me earlier. And I will let you know right now, I'm a real pain in the neck about this. First of all, it is my policy never to refer to the traitor-in-chief as president. He is not anybody's president. He's unfit to be sitting in the Oval Office. And I know you have to do it as part of your job, but I refuse to do that. The other thing I wanted to say is that I think that, I don't know, he's kind of like Cruella de Vil. He sits back in his bedroom at night listening to Hannity on the phone and then thinks up cruel things that he can do to distract from the investigation into his insidious behavior. And apart from the actual inhumanity of this and the fact that he's a complete sociopath, so it doesn't affect him at all, it's a distraction, and in that way it is political. He's doing this so that we're not focused on what Jerry Nadler is doing in the Congress. But to him, it's a big game. Who can I put in charge? Which chess piece am I going to move today to get in everybody's face?
That's giving him a lot of credit.
Thank you.
I have a question that maybe both of you can answer, but it seems to me among the people who are most important in resisting this are not only the lawyers and groups like ACLU and IRAP, but judges across the country. And I wonder how effective Trump has been in appointing conservative judges who will undo some of the good that the judges appointed probably by Democrats, but not all of them. Some of them are decent Republicans.
Let's start with Becca's view from outside, and I'll share my view from the nomination process inside.
I mean, definitely a lot of Trump appointees have gotten through, but I think the bench is pretty interesting right now, because I think that if you want a group of people who are really scared about the rule of law, and who have lifetime appointments, so can be a little less concerned about politics, like it's judges. And so you have a lot of the judges who have made some of the, bolder rulings on things. I can't think of a judge on the child separation policy, but on things like the Muslim ban or the refugee ban or other immigration issues are like George W. Bush appointees, who just I think, and from my perspective, and you say this gently in the book, you point out, for example, that these facilities were not constructed by the Trump administration. They were a lot of the facilities were constructed by the Obama administration, and they're being put to different uses. But from my perspective as an advocate, I think that how far Trump has taken some of this has actually emboldened judges to wade in, whereas they would have been reticent to do it before had it not become so horrible, and that to a certain extent, regardless of political persuasion or who nominated the judge, because some of his own nominees have ruled against him in, again, not in the child separation cases, but in a variety of cases. I think you have judges who see how bad it can be if the rule of law can fall apart, and it's emboldened judges to take some positions on immigration issues that really they ought to have taken perhaps, during the last administration, for example.
So I'll tackle it from the nomination process in the Senate. And let me start by saying there are two things that the Republican leadership wanted most. One was to do tax cuts for the rich, and the second was to control the Supreme Court. In both cases, they have changed the rules of the Senate to do it by simple majority. So the question I'm posing to America and to my colleagues in the Senate is, Republicans have determined to move their agenda for the powerful by simple majority. Are we, as Democrats, going to be determined to move an agenda for the people of the United States by simple majority? Or still allow, even if we take a majority, allow Mitch McConnell as minority leader to block everything, which is what he did under Obama. And it's a really important question, because the H.R. 1, the For the People Act, that takes on gerrymandering, that takes on voter suppression, that takes on dark money, Citizens United money, cannot pass unless we do it by simple majority. And if we don't pass it, we completely lock in a transition of the vision of our government from we the people to we the powerful. So this is very important. Now we come to the judges. What is happening now is Mitch McConnell changed another rule, which was 30 hours of debate on district and circuit court judges, and changed it to 2 hours through a nuclear option, getting a ruling of the parliamentarian and then overturning it by a simple majority. That's a nuclear option, because you don't change the rule, you change the interpretation of the rule. This has allowed him to just take every single vacancy, ram through this far-right stream of judges, which will not be the Bush judges years from now. It will be far different group. The Bush judges came through when you needed a supermajority, and you had to have 30 hours of debate, or at least you could threaten it. So they were much more moderate. At least that's my read on it.
Who got rid of the supermajority necessary for non-Supreme Court judges? Which party?
Yeah, so that was the Democrats. And I'll tell you how this happened. Mitch McConnell basically weaponized the filibuster, the supermajority requirement. And he was blocking the labor commissioners, and he was blocking the labor secretary, and he was blocking other cabinet members, and he was blocking the judges. And so we had a very intense conversation that went on for months about this dysfunction of the Senate. We all met in a no staff, no press meeting in the old Senate chambers to express, our deepest sentiments of our heart about how do we save the Senate. And out of that came an agreement that the Republicans would quit weaponizing the supermajority. And that went on for about a month before Mitch McConnell changed his mind and went back to an all-out blockade. And it was particularly the thing that was final stick was, he said, I don't care how qualified a candidate is, there'll be no Obama judges added to the D.C. Circuit Court. And there were three vacancies that had been empty for a very long time. So that tipped it over the edge. It is, historically, we can say it was a right decision, was a wrong decision. I strongly advocated for it because we can't allow an institution to become weaponized and dysfunctional. But now we're in a place where that comes back to haunt us as well. So there we are.
I'm just weary of things like the more we revert to saying we should pass things by a simple majority because the more we're setting a precedent that the next time they control that particular level of power, they also only need a simple majority.
Yes, and let me share a few thoughts on this question. Our Constitutional Congress was a supermajority body. It was absolutely paralyzed by that. The result was when our founders wrote the Constitution, they put in a supermajority for very specific things, but not for passing bills. Never was a supermajority required in our history until 1917. It was the arming of ships, and it's the first time that the minority essentially used the courtesy of hearing everyone to stop a bill from being passed. So it's not part of our Constitution. There is no supermajority in the Senate in our Constitution. Our whole historic premise is that when it's used routinely, it leads to extraordinary political mischief. This is my reading of history. And if we do not use a simple majority to restore and take on the corruption of our government, if we don't win on gerrymandering and voter suppression and dark money, we are going to lose on health care, housing, education, jobs, the Equality Act, and taking on the carbon pollution and climate chaos. So that's my version of the world. So I think it's worth the risk.
What are they doing with the children when they're in these prisons? Do they have any toys? Do they have any kind of stimulation? And then my second question is, will the United Nations at some point intervene on trying to get these human rights and maybe shame America or shame Trump into doing something?
I'll take the second part first. The UN Human Rights Commission, there have been comments by members about what is going on here, and the head of the commission made some comments the other day. I couldn't quote them exactly, but it was basically, this is horrific, was more or less the gist of it, that being the treatment of refugees on the border. The first part of your question in terms of what happens with the children, well, at the state licensed facilities, there are specific requirements for education, for nutrition, for hygiene, for recreation, and the state provides oversight for that to happen. But the influx facilities, which includes the now shut down Tornillo and Homestead, which is probably going to spring to life here again in a few months, they are not state licensed. And the reason why that they can escape the Flores standards is because the chief petitioner for Flores has not taken that case back to Judge G to get a ruling on whether Flores applies to the influx facilities. I called and talked to him at great length as to why this was the case. A lot of immigration advocates had wondered why not. He decided he would go through a mediation process. Just recently, he's given up on that, is my understanding, and gone back to the court. So we may now have a court ruling. But right now, they're not required to do education. And if you go, when I went to those facilities, well, they would have a teacher with kids in a room that might be doing some kind of little modest exercise, but not a coherent curriculum, not an educational curriculum. And if you recall, it was only a few weeks ago that the president said, I'm not going to let them outdoors to play soccer anymore. Like, because he can say that, because they're not regulated, which is why we can never allow floors to be eliminated and allow the federal government to license itself and monitor itself, because they will do horrific things.
So we have a last question, and then we'll go to the signing.
Thanks so much. So, these are two related questions. One is, how can we find out where these facilities are? How many children are holding? What are the ages of the children? And the other question is, how can we hold people to account for the child abuse, for the Flores violations, for all these other violations that are accumulating that we barely even know about?
Okay, so the location of Homestead is well known. Tornillo was well known. McAllen, CBP facilities, etc. What's not well known are the smaller facilities that are state licensed, that are taking children and then facilitating their movement into homes. And they do deliberately try to keep their addresses out of the press to protect the children. They're very concerned about a lot of these children have escaped gang structures. A lot of people have escaped domestic violence, and many of them are still living in fear. And so it is they go to great lengths to try to not publicize their addresses. They can be found, if you're really determined to find them, by looking up groups that have traditionally provided services to children, because they tend to be the ones the government contracts with. But I have visited a number in Oregon, but we don't publicize where they are. What was the second part of your question?
Yeah, how can we hold people to account on the child abuse and the violations?
Hold account for the child abuse?
Child abuse and the violations of the Flores.
So on the violations of Flores, and our lawyer here can give us much, probably better insight, but the Flores Agreement calls for oversight. It allows groups to go and look at the facilities and to evaluate them, and then to take issues back to the judge if it's not being followed, and then she issues an order saying you got to change what you're doing. That's the basic process.
Yes, well, there's many cool things about Flores. One sort of neat thing is that it's from 1997, but the same judge is still sitting. So each time, like the ACLU, mostly it's the ACLU, there's some other NGOs too, but each time you bring the case back, it's the same judge, Dolly G., who wrote the original agreement, who gets to rule on it. Thank goodness.
No, but the people who run these facilities, like Tornillo or Homestead, okay, they've moved the kids out. They've abused those children. Those children will have lifelong problems from that. And how are they held? They are not held to account. They just go on with their lives. Sorry.
Some of them have successfully brought damages claims against the government. Some parents have successfully brought damages claims based on like the infliction of trauma of separating them from their kids. There's a movement now to try to do more of that. It's not something that can scale because it's pretty tough to bring a lawsuit, and it's really resource intensive and it's slow, so it's not a good remedy for like 3,000 people. From just like a strictly legal point of view, like the people who have brought the cases tend to have won, but it's not something that's going to be like a reparations level solution.
You can't have like a crimes against humanity level.
Presumably like Congress could have a reparations bill.
So essentially the contractors are operating, and I'm not a lawyer, so I may be misusing this term, but under veil of law, is that the right phrase? They have a contract with the U.S. government. I will tell you, I think a lot of the employees are victims of this. When I first went there, my very first trip, when I went to that CBP center, I said to the CBP officers, I said, so you're participating in this process of separating children from the families. How do you feel about that? And they all kind of looked at each other, and then finally one of them said, well, it's not our job to make policy. We simply have to follow orders. but my sense was great distress over being pulled into this horrific act. And I think there are a lot of staff members who have left. There are, I mean, if you tell a child, if you lie to them and say, I'm just taking you away to use the bathroom, but you're really separating them from your mother and father, isn't that going to haunt you the rest of your life? You've lied to them, you've destroyed their trust in institutions. You've been complicit in the trauma. I think a lot of people who work in these places are being badly affected.
I don't mean that level. I'm talking about the higher level.
I'll tell you one piece of county I tried to do was Kirsten Nielsen. She lied to Congress under oath on issue after issue after issue. I lay it all out in the book. I wrote to the FBI and asked them to bring perjury charges. Well, the FBI works under the Department of Justice. The Department of Justice was headed by Jeff Sessions and now Barr. They never replied to my letter. They're never going to act. But that was an effort to say, if you're going to lie under oath, we do have a remedy for that. It is a crime. So let's hold people accountable for it. But the executive branch hasn't seen fit to hold people accountable.
Thank you, Becca Heller, and thank you, Senator Merkley, for all the important work that you do in bringing light to this issue. And so you'll stick around and sign copies of your book if you
I will
don't mind.
indeed. Thank you all so much for being engaged citizens. We need this across America. And Becca, thank you for the work that IRAP is doing, your dedication, your persistence, and really an extended thank you to all those who are working with immigration advocates across this country. Okay, I come over here.